Hi and welcome to today's chat. So this is the first chat that I'm actually doing, and today I am joined by my own sports therapist, and that's Danny. So Danny's of DC Injury Clinic, and Danny has a specialism in neurological conditions, and he does a lot with neuropediatrics. Is that right, Danny?
Yes.
So you work with children with like cerebral palsy and other conditions?
Yeah, I work with lots of that umbrella term of neurodevelopmental conditions. So yeah, cerebral palsy would be, I guess, the primary one, but mitochondrial disease, Bainbridge-Roper's, Rett's syndrome, a broad spectrum of syndromes and conditions, which they all come under that umbrella of neurodevelopmental.
So I asked Danny to come in today because about a couple of weeks ago I was on social media and I saw something that even hadn't crossed my own mind, and that is why pain could be a barrier to exercise to those with a health condition or disability. And I've never had pain when I exercise. If anything, it really helps keep my muscles relaxed, mobile, so that I can actually do more on a daily basis. So it actually did blow my mind when I read this, and when I put it out there when talking to adults with cerebral palsy, it is quite a big barrier actually, which I didn't know. So I thought I'd ask Danny on today so we can talk about this, and also to talk about the actual benefits of exercise and why that it is more of a perceived pain than probably actual pain in a long-term sense. And if anything, it's only going to be a short-term pain. What are your thoughts on this, Danny?
Yeah, exactly what you've just said. I think what's brilliant, actually, that word perceived is hugely important. The perception of pain, which you could talk about for hours, really, that single word. But everything you said, really, pain during and post-exercise, it's quite normal to feel some discomfort with all exercise, but B, normally, it's a secondary pain rather than a primary pain anyway. We were discussing earlier how in our industry they might call it DOMS, for example, but delayed onset muscle soreness, so muscles being used that aren't used to being used, and that muscle soreness, and that's very different from a damage or the condition that someone's presented with. But also exercise, really, and even myself as a therapist, with everyone who comes in, we use exercise as a modulating intervention for pain. So rather than seeing it as something that creates pain, we use it as an intervention to reduce the pain, where we're getting people to utilize greater or different ranges of motion. And that seems to have what we call a top-down regulating factor from the brain, where pain is less because of it. But yeah, we could talk about the mechanisms of pain all day. I'm not sure everyone needs to know the full ins and outs, but yeah, it certainly seems to be that graded exposure is what you would do as a trainer, and what we tend to do as therapists. So we tend to find what is hurting someone, and then a graded exposure to a wider range of building sort of broader foundation so that there's less pain at the output. You sent me some feedback, didn't you, of some comments people had sent into you regarding the pain that they're experiencing, and I think there's a lot to be said for how social media kind of explains pain poorly, or the things that we're led to believe cause pain. And someone had commented about poor movement patterns, and obviously with sort of neurodevelopmental or neuro conditions, they're led to be there are poor movement patterns, but actually we don't anyway. And actually a lot of the things that we're trying to correct as therapists, and I say correct, they're not really poor movement patterns, and there's not this strict kind of correlation between if you move like that, you get this pain. So actually that as a barrier, feeling like you don't move like these, we've just had this discussion, these kind of Instagram movement experts or personal trainers that do look like this socially acceptable perfect specimens, we don't need to look like that. And actually all we're doing really is utilising the movements that are normal to us and building from that.
I think that's important, especially with a neuro condition, because if I squat and you squat, those two squats are going to look massively different. Yet if you try and get me to squat like you, it will cause me pain. because my body is not designed to squat as you knew. My gait, my standing gait is completely different. So I have to squat within a range of movement that is correct for my gait and not what the gait that you're trying to give me.
Yeah.
And I think that's sometimes another issue when the personal trainer or professional is working with a client with a neuro condition that doesn't understand that condition properly. So they will correct the pattern because they're told that the technique has to be this and only this. And I think that's also where pain comes in, because if you said to me, right, Sam, you've got to stand in this position, keep your knees out, I basically couldn't do it. My knees come in when I squat, and that's a very typical neuro gait. So if you've got cerebral palsy, MS, Parkinson's, and the list goes on, your knees will come in because that is a neuro gait. That's how our brain is programmed to how we move, basically. And I think a lot can be said for a lot of trainers out there for working with people they're not actually qualified to work with, because another whole different.
That is, we could go, yeah.
We could be here all day, really.
Yeah, but you're exactly right. And I think that is what we would call staying in your lane, isn't it? And like, I don't pretend to be a personal trainer. You don't pretend to be a sports therapist. We respect the boundaries of our skill sets, don't we? But they cross over massively. But you're exactly right. And we too. And I think that sort of dogmatic approach is prevalent in all aspects of both our industries, where people are looking for these very black and white movement patterns. And unfortunately, there are people, again, on social media, Instagram seems particularly bad at the moment, but they'll have millions of followers and kind of they'll have these really, again, dogmatic approaches, like everyone should squat like this, and if you don't, you are going to get these horrific injuries. And there's nothing in the research that suggests that to be true. And actually, you're exactly right. Even if we take away the cerebral palsy, the length of your thigh bone isn't the same as the length of my thigh bone. Why would we squat the same? It's incredible to think that people are out there. And it's really sad that is clearly becoming a bit of a barrier, because people feel like if they don't look like these perfect specimens, then they shouldn't. And then we get into like there's a psychosocial aspect of the pain as well, because we know things like anxiety and apprehension hugely correlate and contribute to pain, because if your anxiety levels about exercise are high, you're going to start at a slightly worse position, because you're going to be over analyzing everything. Your brain, I always explain the brain, it's like a memory prediction pattern or a feedback loop, where if your brain's looking for something, it's more than likely going to find it. So if you go into an exercise thinking this is going to be bad for my back or this is going to hurt my back, you're probably going to feel more sore than if you go into it thinking this is going to really help me. And the example I always use is that most people sit there and they can't feel their thumb, but as soon as I mention that, everyone can feel their thumb, because their brain's now looking for their thumb. And that's how we, particularly chronic pain, that's how pain can develop, because again, your brain is just constantly saying, does it hurt? Does it hurt? Does it hurt? And if you ask it often enough, sure enough, it's going to be sore. And again, that's why we go into these kind of exercises that, and again, you're right, they should be exercises tailored to the individual, not just this kind of generic approach. But what we're trying to do is almost poke that pain and say, this is fine, this is fine. And then over time, that pain response comes later and later and later. But there is that initial period where, like we've said, DOMS or muscle soreness or aches and pains. And again, what we need to avoid is just that vicious circle of people saying, oh, I did some exercise yesterday and I was a bit sore, so I'm not going to do those again. Whereas actually we know that long term is going to help.
Exactly, and especially for, I'd say, people with a disability who have had that bad experience and then they're going to try again. And they've also got that pain, but it's also because they've not moved in a long time, so that muscle is dormant. So like take your quad stays dormant for say 6 months, maybe a year, and then you go to move it, and all of a sudden it's going ow, ow, but it's not a painful ow, it's just saying, oh, hello, well, what are you doing to me today?
Yeah.
But the more, as Danny said, the more you do it, that pain will go, because that muscle memory will kick in and remember that movement pattern that you're doing, or the exercise that you're doing, so it becomes easier and easier. And the more easier it becomes, the more movement you get, the more mobility you get, the more flexibility you get, and then the positive effects after that, as in your daily life, will be more than if you actually do it.
Yeah, exactly. And again, it's kind of going full circle. It's that word perception, isn't it? Like if the brain has perceived it as being a bad intervention, we know that you're going to have more of a negative response, and that's physical and psychological.
Yeah.
And again, we all know that we've got that Venn diagram of mental health and physical health, and the human in the middle. And quite often we have those two circles, and pain can be in the middle. If someone's particularly stressed and there's been a little bit of muscle soreness, pain can be heightened because that's what brains do, and they're designed to protect us. Whereas again, if we can, the analogy that's very in my world is if we poke the bear be in pain, and if we can just keep poking him until he stops biting back, and that does work for all human beings, regardless of whether they come to me and they've sprained their ankle or whether they've got a neurological condition that's long term. The process is the same, the brain is the same. We would call it neuroplasticity, wouldn't we? Muscle memory, neuroplasticity, and we are changing the brain. Brains are constantly developing and changing, and as long as we're making positive changes, and that is both physical and psychological. And again, that word perception is so important, because if the brain has perceived it to be positive, you'll have a positive experience. If it's perceived it to be negative, you're more likely to have a negative experience.
And I always describe the brain as like a computer. So our brain's our body's computer, and if you take a laptop, I'm recording this on my laptop now, laptops age every time they get slower, but laptops can be rewired. And and even a big desktop can be rewired to do what you want it to do. And our brain's exactly the same. We can rewire or reprogram our brain and our thoughts to do exactly what we want to do, so that if you have that negative thought, you can try and have that positive thought and override the actual negative thought, so you have a positive thought. And the more positive thoughts you have, your brain will go, ooh. And if you do say some sort of exercise, regardless if it's like a gym-based movement, even at home or a fitness class, you'll have those happy endorphins, so your brain is happy, so it will remember that. But if you have a negative experience, it won't remember that. It will only remember the negative side of the activity.
But also, those chemicals you've mentioned they're our brain's natural medicine cabinet.
Yes.
So they are our natural opioids, our natural morphine, really. So again, the more we're doing these things, we're releasing these chemicals, serotonin, endorphins, and they're all incredibly powerful pain relievers. So hugely important. Again, that kind of we feel less pain, so we feel more confident to do more activity, which creates more endorphins and more chemicals, which creates less pain, which encourages to do more movement, and it becomes self-fulfilling in a positive direction, rather than exactly what you said, where if we try and bubble wrap everyone and say don't move because it might hurt, then when they do move, and they're going to have to move at some point, it's going to be a little bit more sensitive than if they were used to moving.
And I think also that's why now a lot of medical professionals are referring exercise as prescription for treatment of a lot of conditions, because it is actually the best thing for you. If you've got a bad back, if you've got any type of arthritis, you've got osteoporosis, any type of disability, GPs and even specialists are now looking at the positive effect of exercise, and it's a cheaper version than pumping those drugs into you, because in the long run, drugs are only a short-term fix, whereas exercise is a long-term fix, and one that we should be promoting more of than actually pumping ourselves with loads of drugs that are only going to have a short-term fix. Like a lot of people I know with CP will have Botox, but Botox is only a short-term fix, whereas your body gets used to it, and you have Botox, it's not going to have the same effect as when you had it at the start.
Yeah, perfect. Yeah, again, and I always describe those things. You kind of got the ground force, really, which is our exercise therapy, isn't it? We're the ground force troops, and then you've kind of got you can send the tanks in, which is normally your injections, and then all of a sudden the next stage from there is your full-blown invasion, where it's an operation, which we should try and keep people away from that at all costs, because even though they're inherently safe, there's going to be inherent risks to an operation. And again, ultimately, if we keep the mind happy and the body happy, those things are your last resort. And yeah, like I say, the perceived pain was interesting when you mentioned that perceived the pain related to exercise was an interesting one that you and I, it kind of surprised us a little bit, didn't it? But it makes perfect sense. And again, I think it's multifactorial. But I think we need to move a little bit away from that ideal that doesn't really exist. Like we know, clinically speaking, statistically speaking, the metadata says that these normal movement patterns that are sold, and it is a sales technique, they don't exist, and so we don't need to aim for those. They're not important to us. Movement is medicine, and it's all relative to the individual at their time.
And also, on top of exercise, diet helps massively. Like, I don't know if many people know this, but sugar is a great inflammatory for our muscles. So actually, sugar isn't good for our muscles, it's not good for our joints, and it can have a big effect on our joints. So making sure that we eat a very good, nutritious, balanced diet with little sugar. We obviously use some sugar of a white sugar, but not the actual bad sugar, is actually key on top of that as well. So,
yeah, good. Yeah.
So that, hope that is interesting. I know we could talk all day on this. So I hope that is interesting. And if you have any comments, obviously put them below. I think it's below on every platform I'm putting this on. And hopefully I'll be back with someone else very soon. Thank you for me.
Thank you very much.
Bye.